The topic of the Civil War is more relevant in Russia today than ever before. It was hard to imagine that in the modern Russian Federation of the 2020s, events would occur that resemble the history of 100 years ago when the Reds fought the Whites. But that's only at first glance, although of course, history itself will eventually put everything in its proper place. Few would argue with the fact that in Russia, which unleashed a war against Ukraine, a profound systemic crisis has been exposed due to the so-called special military operation, which has dragged on far longer than expected and is not going according to plan at all. It is no longer possible to simply wave off this crisis, especially since the war has already spilled over onto Russian territory. Whether this is a civil war, a revolution, a mutiny, a coup, or something else, we will only find out with time. And to understand what is happening today, it would be useful to recall events from days long past. So, let's travel back to 1918. From February 1918 to October 1922, a civil war raged across the territory of the former Russian Empire, in which the White Guards, supporters of monarchism and the preservation of the empire, clashed with hordes of Reds who, as they proclaimed, were fighting for liberty, equality, and fraternity. Incidentally, that is the motto of the French Republic. The White cause was defeated. More than 2 million Russians, whose fate became tied to the defeat of Bolshevism, went into exile. The majority of the refugees settled in Europe, while Russia itself was left in ruins. Today, historians argue about the number of lives lost in the Civil War. Was it 10 or 12 million? On the smoldering ruins of the former empire, the communists built a new state, the USSR, which Putin is now straining to revive. But how did rootless adventurer revolutionaries manage to defeat the former Tsarist generals, the noble and educated aristocrats? The answer to this question is not as obvious as it might seem, even to experts in history. This is because some of the accounts from participants in those events present a one-sided picture of what happened. For example, former member of the State Duma and participant in the White Movement Nikolai Lvov, already in exile, recalled, "The end of our struggle came on the day when the blood-soaked army was once again left alone in the fight. The only reason for our defeat lies in military factors, the imbalance of forces, the exhaustion of our manpower, our technical and combat resources." After the defeat, the White generals were accused of indecisiveness. There were opinions that Denikin supposedly should have come to an agreement with the Ukrainians and advanced on Moscow together. Rodzianko was expected not to hesitate and to advance energetically on Petrograd. Kolchak divided his army, but instead he should have stormed Samara with a united front, then Kazan, and from there Moscow was not far off. But, in reality, the defeat of the White Guards cannot be explained by strategic mistakes alone. Former Tsarist generals more than once crushed Red divisions with much smaller forces, but their successes did not bring them closer to victory. There were also other objective reasons, arguably even more important, which nullified the military skill of the Whites. So why did the Whites actually lose to the Reds? Stay tuned. It will be interesting. But first I ask you to subscribe to our channel and click the bell so you don't miss new videos. Support our efforts on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Follow us on Telegram and Twitter. All the links are in the description and the first comment. So let's start with the simplest explanation for the Whites' defeat, which, as we remember, is not at all obvious and is merely a consequence of deeper reasons. And why that is, you'll understand in a moment. The Reds' superiority in manpower. By the end of 1919, the Red Army numbered 3 million soldiers, and it was made up not only of workers and peasants. 43% of the officers who took part in the Civil War sided with the Bolsheviks. Under the red flag fought the renowned General Brusilov, hereditary nobleman General Bonch-Bruyevich, military geographer General Snesarev, and General Staff Colonel Kamenev. Of course, they were not imbued with the ideas of communism and world revolution, but they decided to serve the new Russia, which, with the arrival of the Bolsheviks, did not cease to exist, but simply changed its system. In the Red Army, former imperial officers were called military specialists, and they were considered hostile elements to the USSR. Just 12 years later, in 1931, most of these people were either executed or sent to labor camps. The situation in the White Armies was even worse. The first volunteers for the counter-revolutionary armed forces were grey-haired colonels and very young cadets and military school students. While fierce battles raged at the front and the white regiments lacked soldiers, in the rear cities, thousands of officers in dress uniforms escorted ladies to restaurants and theaters. The shortage of troops became the decisive factor that prevented the whites from clearing Moscow of the Bolsheviks. In the summer of 1919, Denikin led his troops on a campaign toward Moscow. The outnumbered white regiments ground down the red divisions and, suffering heavy losses, advanced toward Russia's old capital. In October 1919, national units of the Red Army, recruited from Latvians, Estonians, and Chinese, counterattacked the volunteers. Denikin had no strength left to repel the attack, and the whites abandoned first Oryol and Kursk, and then Ukraine. After this retreat, the agony of the Southern White Army began. But why did the whites lack manpower, while the red divisions were overflowing with soldiers? It all came down to a few simple things, one of which was red propaganda. The whites lost the battle for people's minds. Throughout the entire war, they never managed to come up with slogans that resonated with the people. Denikin's call for a united and indivisible Russia sounds noble, but these words do not touch the heart of a peasant from Tambov or a worker from Tula. It also alienated the inhabitants of the national borderlands of the former empire who were striving for independence. And just look at the Bolsheviks' slogan: factories to the workers, land to the peasants, peace to the huts, war to the palaces. This message is clear to everyone. It promises a future both to the worker and the peasant, and most importantly, it guarantees retribution for the rich and the exploiters who had lived off the people for centuries. The Reds skillfully used propaganda and won despite defeats on the battlefield. By the way, the opponents of communism only started calling themselves White Guards while in exile, and the term whites was first introduced by Leon Trotsky. People were convinced that with Denikin and Wrangel not only the bourgeoisie would return, but also the Tsar. Although the counter-revolution never advocated for the restoration of the monarchy. Only once, in 1922 in Primory, did the Zemsky Sobor put forward the slogan, "For the Tsar." The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, had a new idea that appealed to the masses. Communism was the future, where everyone would surely be well-fed and at peace, while the monarchy was a decrepit past with priests, manor houses, and whips. And there would be no more of that famous crunch of French bread. Despite the clear success of the Reds' slogans, the whites were in no hurry to form a competitive agenda. In response to the Bolshevik slogan, "Land to the peasants," the whites simply ignored the land question. The land question was the most pressing issue in the Russian Empire and concerned the peasants, who made up 86% of the population. One of the first decisions of the Soviet government was to adopt the decree on land. All land owned by landlords and the church was confiscated and transferred to the control of local peasant committees and councils. The leaders of the white movement did everything they could to avoid this issue, continually postponing its resolution. First, the Bolsheviks had to be driven out, and only then would the land be divided. And how could it even be resolved? After all, a large segment of the revolution's opponents were the landowners, who, after victory, hoped to return to their ancestral estates. The confiscation of landlords' land automatically brought millions of peasants over to the Bolshevik side. The poor expected to receive their own plots, while the middle peasants and future kulaks hoped to add some new land to their holdings. That is precisely why numerous peasant partisan detachments arose in the White Rear, disrupting the volunteer army's communications. And after the Bolsheviks arrived, they joined the revolutionary forces. The subsequent policy of war communism disappointed the Russian peasant farmer, but by then it was too late. The Bolsheviks had taken root, and it became impossible to wrest power from their hands. It is worth noting that in addition to the appealing Bolshevik propaganda during the Civil War, the Reds' victory over the Whites was largely due to two other important factors: the Reds' control over Central Russia and their treachery. At the beginning of the Civil War, centers of resistance to Bolshevik power sprang up all across Russia. The Don, the Kuban, and the Caucasus flared up. The Whites seized power in Siberia and threatened Petrograd. Ukraine, Finland, and other national republics of the former empire were preparing to secede. The Bolsheviks were surrounded by enemies, and their collapse seemed only a matter of time. However, the Communist Party managed to retain control over central and northwestern Russia with its large population, vast stockpiles of weapons, and strategically important factories and plants, where workers who had joined the ranks of the Red Guard labored. The region also had an extensive railway network, which allowed the Reds to quickly transfer troops from one front to another. Material and military aid from the former Allies could not offset such a disparity in resources between the Whites and the Reds. The Bolsheviks easily formed alliances, and just as easily and treacherously betrayed those allies. This is exactly what they did with Adam and Makhno and the national governments that had declared their secession from Russia. The Reds promised them freedom, but once they had gained enough strength, they forcibly incorporated them into the USSR through Red Terror. The Reds were skilled at making grand promises they had no intention of keeping, while at the same time the Whites demonstrated a lack of a unified idea within the White movement. Even the White generals could not find common ground. General Krasnov did not want to submit to Denikin. Ataman Semyonov, relying on Japan, established his own government in Transbaikalia and ignored the orders of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Kolchak. The Don, Kuban, and Terek Cossacks never followed the generals and instead sought to create their own states, free from the power of Red commissars and White landowners. The Whites, divided by parties and social classes, had nothing to discuss with 90% of their country's population. The situation is best described by the words of one of the White movement's ideologists, Vasily Shulgin: "Our cause is lost." Does Russia really need Bolshevism? Has the idea of nationalism really been defeated by the idea of internationalism only because all the filth and scum mixed in with us have turned us into defenders of the interests of the landowning class against the Bolsheviks, who present themselves as defenders of the interests of workers and peasants? It is painfully upsetting. We lost only because we played badly, that's all. We rushed, we showed no political maturity, and we ruined a pure idea. The Bolsheviks were a monolithic united force, opposed by the fragmented forces of the counter-revolution. The Red leaders worked themselves to exhaustion. They broke down old foundations, came up with slogans, never left the front lines, and, relying on military specialists as best they could, directed the combat operations. The Bolsheviks skillfully manipulated the people and understood what promises to make to get them to follow. The Reds saw their goal and ignored any obstacles. With lies, treachery, terror, and brute force, they imposed their own order. And what was the result? Peasants and workers did not want to fight for the return of land, factories, and plants to their former owners, so they looked toward Red Moscow. Although they didn't really trust the Bolsheviks and sensed some kind of trickery, they definitely did not want to return to the old regime, let alone the Tsar. And the Whites weren't planning to offer anything new. In a memorandum addressed to Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, White officers wrote, "The Bolsheviks also did not capture the soul of the people, nor did they become a national phenomenon. But they far outpaced us in the speed of their actions, in energy, mobility, and their ability to coerce. With our old methods, old mentality, the old vices of military and civil bureaucracy, and Peter the Great's table of ranks, we could not keep up with them." The White volunteers could say they were fighting against the communists, but they struggled to answer the question, what are they fighting for? What will happen next? What will the future structure of Russia be, and what will happen with the land? Hence the small number of volunteers and the forced mobilizations, which, by the way, also took place among the Reds. The two revolutions in Russia in 1917, the Civil War, and ultimately the formation of the man-eating Red Empire known as the USSR, this is a profound tragedy for 1/6 of the world's landmass and for the peoples who, by misfortune, became part of this foul Russian world, which even now still stirs its tentacles, writhing in prolonged death throes. The Whites lost in 1922, the Reds in 1991. I wonder, in what year will the Brown Russians lose? I'm sure they don't have much time left.